Hi, I'm Jervis Lewis, and in this video I'm going to show you how to use the 3D features in Photoshop. And we're going to do this by texturing a 3D object in Photoshop. Now, Photoshop, ever since CS3, had something of a version that was called Photoshop Extended, and that carried on until Photoshop CS6, and it also of course carried over into Photoshop CC. And anything prior to CC that was called Extended was a couple $100 more expensive and had fully fledged 3D options, whereas there also was a version that was $200 more, well, cheaper, and that didn't have all the 3D options. Sadly, it was very complicated to upgrade from the non-extended to the extended version, but with CC, ever since 2014, I guess they introduced it, that is now history, and everyone who has Photoshop CC also automatically has access to the 3D features. So what we'll discuss in this video are, well, basically all the little 3D things that Photoshop can do. One of them is navigating the 3D space in Photoshop. It works much like a fully fledged 3D app. So we can tilt the camera, we can move the objects, we can scale them, and so forth. Another very important thing that comes in handy for texturing is displaying and selecting UVs. So sometimes it's not always obvious from a 2D flat texture file where the corresponding points on the 3D object are, so that can make texturing a little bit more cumbersome, and I'll show you a way how Photoshop can help you there. Also, we're going to discuss painting directly onto 3D objects, including painting across seams. That's very difficult on a 2D flat file, and that's much easier on a 3D object directly. And also we're going to discuss how to view the 2D flat file and the 3D object at the same time in Photoshop. And all that makes texturing a lot easier. Remember, you have all the funky tools that Photoshop has to offer, including paths and selections and patterns and blending options and material overlays and all that sort of stuff. The tools we use in this video are Photoshop CC 2015, release 1.2, and I'm doing this on a Mac El Capitan with version 10.11.6. Without further ado, let's be creative. Photoshop understands a variety of 3D formats, but to make it really easy, I've exported a dress by 3D Universe out of DAZ Studio. It's the Willow Dress that comes with a Willow character, and I've just exported that as a wavefront OBJ in centimeters. And I'm going to import that now into Photoshop. For that, you head over to File, and you can just use Open. I've put it on my desktop and I just called it Dress. And there we go, a little preview comes up that this is in fact the dress we're after. And Photoshop has detected it is a wavefront OBJ. So hit Open. And the first thing that happens is the import dialog in terms of how is the 3D object supposed to be imported. I exported it with centimeters as my 3D unit, so I'm going to change that and accept the defaults and hit OK. And there we have it. This is the object, complete with a light source that looks a little bit too hot. So the first thing you'll notice is that you have a layer, just like any other Photoshop layer. And when you hover into the document, you have this weird cursor here. Anywhere where it's not showing this bounding box across the object, so if you hover away from the object, hold down the mouse and see that you can tumble around the object. That's quite cool. And you can also see this white dot at the top here, this thing. That is the light source that Photoshop has provided so that we can see some shadows here, see some details. Sadly though, the light source right now is a little bit too hot, so I can barely see the texture that is on this object. So let's fix that. Select the light, and up comes this weird kind of joystick type thing. And what you can do with that is move it around, so you can move the light source and therefore direct the shadows and the light source to a different place. So perhaps you want to illuminate the object from the back or maybe further from the left. And once selected, this thing stays in place. On the right hand side here, on the properties, you can see that we can dial down the intensity a little bit. We can also change the light color. We can even change the type from an infinite light to a spotlight or a point light. or switch on and off shadows and make them softer. I'll let you play with those in your own time. First of all, we're going to dial down the intensity to something like that. Much better. And to get rid of that joystick thing, all we need to do is click off the object somewhere next to it. There we go. And now you can tumble around it. Not only is there an infinite light supplied by Photoshop, there's also an IBL light supplied. As you can see, we can see the back of the dress, and in true 3D fashion, we shouldn't be seeing anything if there wouldn't be any sort of IBL light source in here. And on the 3D layer, you can see that at the bottom, there is in fact a default IBL light in here. And just like with all the other Photoshop features, if you click on one of those little eyeballs, it will switch that feature off. And if we do that, in fact, the back of the dress is completely black, while the front is still illuminated by our infinite light. So that's a nice touch here. Another thing you can do is select the object directly, so where the bounding box come up, just tap in there, and you'll see your familiar 3D cursor pop up, so the 3D manipulator. And it works exactly like in other 3D apps you may have used. The white thing in the middle scales this whole thing up or down, and any of these arrows either moves the object by holding down the arrow, or holding down that little half round thing will rotate the object, or this little square thing here will stretch the object into that one direction. Now, if this happens by accident, you're going to distort the object, or you may move the object from where it needs to be, or where it would be easiest to have it, which is the center of the 3D universe. And you can head over here to the Properties panel and select this little bounding box thing here, and hit this button here, Reset Coordinates, and that will in fact reset the whole thing and put the median point right into the center of the scene. Now, that's also not really what we want. We want our object probably to rest on the ground, and that's where the second option comes in, Move to Ground. So do that, and then the object is more or less probably where you want it to be. To get out of this 3D cursor type thing and go back into the camera manipulation mode, just click off it until this cursor appears, tap it, and you're back in camera manipulation mode. We also have a couple of diffuse texture maps here. One is the Drop Trim, and one is the 3DU Willow Dress DF. And again, you can switch these on and off and see which texture you'd like to work with. I'm not sure what the Drop Trim is in this object, but this one is certainly the texture I'd like to work with, because I guess I'd like to replace some of these things and perhaps put my own patterns on here. And to do that, we double click on this texture. There could also be others. There could be, for example, bump maps or transparency maps. They would all be showing up in here. So double click the texture you want to work with. In my case, this one, 3DU Willow Dress DF. And Photoshop will say this texture is used in multiple places on the object. Changes to this texture will appear in all places. That's a nice touch. And what it will do is open a second document. So this is my 3D document here. And this is my 2D document, which is basically just the texture file, which it has converted into a PSD file. So I've got all my 2D features here. I can create layers, I can create flood fills and paths and whatnot, and save this as a PSD file as my 2D texture file. Now, right now, this object, I'm really not sure what is what on this 2D texture map. Sometimes 2D textures give away just by the way they're formatted, I guess, what is where on the 3D object. Right now, I have no idea. I guess somewhere here will be the skirt, and this is probably the belt. But really, I don't have a UV template here which would allow me to see what object is what. And Photoshop has a great feature there under the Properties palette, under the 3D Paint thing. If we scroll down a little bit, here's a tick box called UV Overlays. And if you tick that, Photoshop will show you where the UVs are. And that is quite handy. You can even change the color or the opacity. So if it's too dark for you, if it's too light for you, we can make that a little bit stronger. And now I can see this is probably the skirt. This is probably the belt with a bow. And this is perhaps the top here. That all kind of makes sense. But what would make even more sense is if we could see these two things side by side, so that we could see the 3D object and the 2D object at the same time. And again, of course, Photoshop has a built-in feature which is just to display both documents side by side. So these two here. And the way to do that is to head over to the Window tab, click Arrange, Tile all vertically. So this works best if you really only have two documents open. If you have 5 or so, that could become a bit of an issue, but tile all vertically will do the trick. And there we go. We can see our 3D object here and our 2D object here. Notice though that these are still two separate documents. So in order to work with one, it's not enough to hover. You have to physically go in and tap this window to make it active. And because this is 3D and this is 2D, Photoshop will now be a little bit more sluggish than in normal standalone 2D mode, because it has to convert one thing into the other in the background. Let's create a new layer here in our 2D window. If I select my 2D window and create a new layer onto which I could draw if I wanted to, perhaps with a funky color. Let me grab my brush and start drawing. I can literally paint a texture like so, and whatever I do in one window appears in the other window as well. I think perhaps my light is still a little bit hot, so let me just click into this window here, wait until Photoshop is, select my move tool, select my light, and dial down the intensity of the light a little bit further. There we go. Now I can see my drawings here a little bit better. I'll change back to the brush tool. And the funky thing is that no matter which window I am in, I can now see which point is in 2D or in 3D. So right now I'm hovering over the 2D window. And this is not part of my dress here, but this is, and I can even see exactly where that is in the 3D view. Or I can go over to the 3D window and hover over the dress anywhere I like, and I can see where that point is, the corresponding point is in the 2D texture map. So that is very cool. If you want to tumble around the dress now in the 3D view, you don't have to change back to the move tool if you don't want to. You can just hover over these three icons here. Hover over the first one to orbit the camera, just like what we did with this weird cursor which now appears. Just hold down and then move this thing. Or you can pan the camera, or you can dolly the camera in and out, so zoom in and out. If you want to do any detailed close-up work, you can do that. Let's turn this thing to the back, and this seam is indeed at the very back of the dress. Now I can draw on the 3D object directly, and the result will be a stroke inclusive of pressure sensitivity and whatnot in the 2D window. And the funky thing is I can also paint across seams. Now that is funky. Let me just zoom in here. This is the seam, as you can see from the texture, and I can indeed make a stroke directly across it. And Photoshop adds a little bit extra margin at the front and the back. And this allows you to paint textures directly onto a 3D object. And if you find it's easier to do them in 2D, you just switch to the 2D window and then you paint your texture here. So far, so good. Now, these 3D overlays here, they are nice, but they're not really letting me select something, so they're not part of a layer. If they'd be part of my 2D layer somehow, I would be able to select the background or select the UV and create flood fills based on selections. And let's talk about that next. Let me switch off my background layer here, and in fact my painted layer, so that we're left with just the UVs. But these are just overlays, so they're like, think of them as a guide, like almost like displaying a ruler or something. They don't, I can't really do anything with them. They're a nice guide, but that's really all they are. So let me switch them off and head over to the 3D menu. Head over down to Create Painting Overlay and select Wireframe. And if you do that, a new layer is created here, physical layer, with the UVs in place. Now they look a little bit dim here, but if you zoom in, you can just see that they are in fact black. They're just very thinly painted here. And that's okay, that's no problem. It's just when I zoom out, they appear to be hardly there. And that's probably also because I've got the transparent checkerboard background here. So to make that a bit more easier for us to see, let me just create a new solid color layer in white and put that to the very bottom here. There, that's much easier to see. Now, before I forget, this layer here with our UVs on it now, let's rename that and call it UVs. Whoops. UVs. There. And because in the 2D view I have all the 2D tools that I'm used to in Photoshop, I can now create another layer on which I may work in a minute and grab my trusty old magic wand tool and simply select the white background here. And that'll create a selection of the white, basically the inverse of what I want. So since it is the inverse of what I want, let me just head over to Select and invert that selection. And now everything that is a UV is selected. That's pretty cool. Let me expand that so that I have a little bit of extra margin here. Again, that's under the Select menu, Modify, Expand. 5 pixels should do the trick. And if I do that, the selection just becomes that a little bit wider, which is cool. Now these selections, I may want to split them up. So technically what I can do now on my second layer is I could grab my paint bucket tool and just flood fill the whole shebang. And if I do that, you see that the changes are not quite reflected in my 3D object just yet. That's only because I guess Photoshop is saving some resources there. As soon as I select the 3D window, Photoshop goes to work and displays my changes right there. Let me go back here to my 2D window and save this selection. This is one very helpful thing. Usually you want to split that up. You don't want to flood fill the whole dress with the same color. You may want this in a different color or with a different material, and the rim here with a different material, and so forth. So it is probably wise to split these things up. And it's a little bit of extra work, but we always want to go back to this selection here so we can save it and bring it back anytime we like. So let me show you how to do that. Under Select, save the selection and call it Everything. And this is saved as a new channel. If you head over here to the Layers palette, next to it you see the Channels palette. Have a look, there's the red, green and blue and the Composite, and there's our new channel, Everything. So if I now go ahead and deselect Everything, if I wanted to bring it back, head over to Select, load the selection, pick it from the list where it says Everything, and then everything is back selected. Now say I wanted to separate the skirt out because I want to have a different pattern on the skirt than on these parts here. Then what I can do is take my quick selection tool, or even in fact just select the rectangular marquee tool, and just make sure we're on this little icon, which means subtract from the current selection. This would be select whatever I'm selecting. This is add to the selection. This is subtract from the selection. So I'll just draw a square around this. This is now all unselected and only the skirt remains. Now, same thing again, select, save selection, and call it skirt. There it is. So I can go back to another layer here. create a layer, and perhaps in a different color so I can tell it apart. I can now flood fill the skirt with a different color. Flat colors are nice, but you probably want to add some kind of material to it. And of course that's possible with the 2D features in Photoshop. So just hover over a layer, select blending options, and add a pattern overlay. Select any of the patterns that are dear to you. Yeah, perhaps we'll stick with the blue here. Just tap into the 3D window so that the texture gets ported across, and there we have it. And you can do the same thing with all the other parts here. You can separate them out, head back into the 2D window and load the everything selection and just do the same thing that I did before. Subtract maybe the skirt and subtract all these parts so that you're only left with the bow here in the middle, and so forth, and take it from there. One other thing that's quite cool about the Photoshop 3D features is that you can composite 2D elements on top of or behind the 3D layer. If we just focus on the 3D object again, head over to Window, Arrange, Consolidate All to Tabs. You can see that this is just a layer. It has 3D features, but it is just a normal layer. So we could create another layer and put it underneath the 3D object, which could become our background. So you can take a brush and just paint the background as you see fit, with a gradient or just with, add embellishments or whatever you like. Let me delete that and replace it with a radial gradient, for example. Something like this. Perhaps that's a little bit pop art here. But the point I'm trying to make is that this is a 2D layer, and as soon as you click the 3D layer again, say this could be your character or this is an item of clothing you'd like to showcase, you can then position this anywhere you see fit. So the rendering, it is only OpenGL, so therefore it's not perfect, but for a quick and dirty, this is what it would look like. It certainly helps. That was it. I hope this was helpful. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked this video, please share it with friends, family, and total strangers. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Bye for now. I will see you next time.